right, now as I recall, we were in Genesis 43. And left off, what's that?
16?
Yeah, pretty much. Left off, as Merrill mentioned, in verse 16. We have here the second trip south to Egypt. And you'll recall at this point, Simeon is still in prison. I can't help but wonder, though, and the Bible doesn't tell us one way or the other, but I can't help but wonder if Joseph probably did not leave orders that Simeon would be well treated and well provided for while he was there. So I'm not sure that Simeon would have really gotten the full effect of being in prison, but
He was probably under house arrest.
yeah, I doubt
Not in the dungeon.
All right, well, however he got taken care of, nobody still at this point knows that Joseph is Joseph. Verse 16. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, of course, let me back up to verse 15 to get this in context. So the men took this present, which you'll recall that Jacob had told them to take all kinds of extra stuff with them to essentially bribe and butter up Joseph, thinking that he was just the prime minister. Said, and they took double the money in their hand and Benjamin. Then they arose and went down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to his house steward, bring the men into the house and slay an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon. Now, isn't this a step up from being in prison to now he's apparently provided his own house, and I'm sure that the house he was living in was probably a palace. He's got his own servants and men that are waiting on him hand and foot. Verse 17, so the men did as Joseph said and brought the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, it is because of the money that was returned in our sacks the first time that we are being brought in, that he may seek occasion against us and fall upon us and take us for slaves with our donkeys. Now, why would this point, if they're going to be escorted to Joseph's home, would they think that, well, this is it?
Well, they think they're about to be made his personal house slaves.
Probably either brought into slavery or that they're being taken out of public view for a private execution, if you will.
Disappear.
What's that?
Disappear.
Yeah, they're thinking we're just going to disappear. And nobody's going to know what happened to us. Because, well, look at it from their perspective. They still don't know who this man is, and here they are being escorted to his home. They figured there is no reason in the world that this man would be inviting us to his house, so something sneaky is up.
They knew who he was, it might even be more scary though.
That's a good possibility. So, going to take us for slaves with our with our donkeys. So they came near to Joseph's house. Excuse me. Better. So they came near to Joseph's house steward and spoke to him at the entrance of the house and said, "Oh, my Lord, we indeed came down the first time to buy food, and it came about when we came to the lodging place that we opened our sacks, and behold, each man's money was in the mouth of his sack, our money in full. So we brought it back in our hand." Why would they tell the guy this?
They weren't trying to play they didn't steal it.
Well, they still think that it was all a mistake, and that they're being taken to Joseph's house to be, accused of stealing, executed, sold into slavery, since the money got taken back. Any number of things would be going through their heads at this point. So they're trying to head off any possible accusations by telling Joseph's head steward here that, well, whatever happened, we didn't do it. We don't know how that happened. But here we've got the money with us. Here it is. So verse 22 says, we've also brought down our money in our hand to buy food. We do not know who put our money in our sacks. And this is of course the house steward, he said, be at ease, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money. Then he brought Simeon out to them. All right, now, notice it said your God. Now, the house steward is an Egyptian. But also notice there's no indication at this point. Now there could be, but no indication that he's having to speak through an interpreter. Do you think there's a possibility that Joseph has appointed himself a house steward that might have been bilingual?
Absolutely.
Good possibility of that. Also,
and knows of Joseph's God.
And knows of Joseph's God. So, he said, your God and the God of your father. He does not speak at this point as one who says the gods or anything of Egyptian nature. Yeah, as Merrill just mentioned, there's a possibility that either this guy is bilingual or maybe of Hebrew origin himself, or you think maybe Joseph has had the opportunity to tell him about God? Just the way he speaks seems to indicate that this guy's got some insight that we would not expect of the average Egyptian.
But he also could still be a typical Egyptian who believes in many gods and just believes that the Hebrew God is one of the many.
And that's
and
a possibility.
Their God, because he says your God,
But the fact that he says that would not necessarily mean that he didn't believe in God, because if he is in on the charade here, which I think there's a good possibility of that if he's in on the whole deal, he wouldn't want to tip his hand that this was all just a plot on Joseph's part. But says, then he brought Simeon out to them. Now, why at this point has he brought Simeon out?
So he can participate in the banquet.
Going to participate in the banquet, but also, if they think we're about to be enslaved, and lo and behold, here comes Simeon walking in, either one of two things. Either they're going to think, oh, we are sunk now because he's going to get all of us, or the fact that Simeon walks in, they think the other side, or the other possibility is they may think, well, maybe we are about to have a big banquet because here comes Simeon. He was in prison and now they brought him out.
The man kept his word. He said, when you bring Benjamin, I'll release Simeon.
So, could go either way. But clearly, as we can see from the context, they took it as a good sign. Verse 24 says, then the man brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet, and he gave their donkeys fodder. Now, to go into a man's home, this was a common Middle Eastern custom. We see it not just in Canaan, but obviously they did it here in Egypt as well. When you were entertained in a person's home, because a lot of these folks either they were barefooted or they might have sandals on, but in a dusty environment, if all you've got sandals, guess what? Your feet's still going to get pretty dirty. And you go into a man's home, well, you're going to take your sandals off, set them there by the door, either be provided something or you're going to be walking around inside barefoot. Well, it was customary that the servant would wash your feet. And if they didn't wash your feet, well, that was just considered bad hospitality. I mean, Jesus himself mentioned that a few times in homes that he had been invited into. One particular Pharisee, I recall, that he pointed out to the guy, said, I've been here for a while teaching, and said, at no time have you offered to wash anybody's feet. So this was a custom that was well known and had been around for quite some time. Now, why is that a good sign for them? Because if they were going to be grabbed by the guards and thrown into prison or enslaved, would the house servants be washing their feet? Unlikely. They'd be grabbed and they'd be the one doing the washing. The fact that somebody has walked in, the house stewards, and now come in with pan of water, a towel, washing their feet, this is an indication to them that, well, they're extending hospitality to us. This is a good sign. So they prepared the present. Now, which present are we talking about?
The extra goods.
Yeah, all these extra goods that they came to butter up Joseph with. So they prepared the present for Joseph's coming at noon, for they had heard that they were to eat a meal there. When Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the present which was in their hand, and bowed to the ground before him. Now, at this point, with Simeon and Benjamin with them, we see the fulfillment of a dream Joseph had over 20 years previously, probably 21, 22 years before. This certainly is not going to escape Joseph's notice. And it's interesting. Now, the fact that they are all together bowing down before this man, you have to wonder, have any of them, has it crossed their mind that, wait a minute, we've heard this once before?
They're also no longer in the big audience hall where they're probably a good distance away from him. They're in his home, right in close contact with him, and they still don't recognize him.
Still don't recognize him, but I guarantee...
he probably looks like an Egyptian.
But also, I guarantee you, even though they were in his home, I guarantee you there were guards present. Because even though Joseph probably trusts them at this point, simply because of protocol and to maintain the appearances, I guarantee you there was still probably at least 2 or 3 guards standing close by with a sword. But anyway, verse 26. So when Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the present which was in their hand, and bowed to the ground before him. Then he asked them about their welfare, and said, "Is your old father well, of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" Of course, Joseph naturally wants to know this. They said, "Your servant, our father, is well." Notice how they refer to this, your servant. This is not just an arbitrary form of address. That is a normal protocol to indicate that they recognize this man's authority and refer to anyone else as your servant. I mean, that's in the same sense that we would refer to a judge as your honor, or, so to refer to somebody else as your servant, that's just an address of respect. Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive. And they bowed down in homage. And he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. He said, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me?" And he said, "May God be gracious to you, my son." Now notice, again, I guarantee you this particular address would not have been overlooked by the brothers. Joseph does not address any of the rest of them in such a manner. He pronounces this benediction, if you will, on his little brother Benjamin. Of course, naturally, he asks, "Is this him?" Because, well, how old was he by this point?
31.
Probably 30, 31 years old, and Joseph hasn't seen him in about 21 years. So he was a kid the last time Joseph saw him. So naturally, he doesn't immediately recognize him, but by process of elimination figures this has got to be Benjamin. So he asked, and then as soon as they confirm, yes it is, he pronounces a benediction on him and refers to him as my son. Now, for an Egyptian leader of this sort to refer to somebody as my son was an extreme compliment and an indication to them that at least Benjamin certainly had nothing to worry about. He would not have referred to somebody that they were about to throw in prison or to enslave as my son.
He also didn't ask for a blessing from an Egyptian god.
No.
Which should have been another clue to them. That this guy is not really an Egyptian.
However, now what we're not seeing here, and don't overlook this, it's a pretty safe bet that Joseph did not utter this benediction to Benjamin directly. Because if he'd have spoken to him directly in Hebrew, what would that have done to this whole charade?
Collapsed it.
The jig is up.
Yeah, the jig is up. So clearly this part, even though we're not told about the presence of an interpreter, clearly Joseph would have spoken to him in Egyptian, and that then would have been pronounced to him in through the interpreter, which, by the way, the interpreter could very well have been the house steward. Verse 30. And Joseph hurried out, for he was deeply stirred over his brother. And he sought a place to weep, and he entered his chamber and wept there. This part should be pretty obvious. Joseph hasn't seen his little brother in 21, 22 years, and I think we can understand why Joseph probably made a hasty exit at this point. The question you'd have to wonder about is, from the brother's perspective, why has this man just pronounced a blessing upon our little brother, and then he suddenly turns and takes off? And also the house steward, the guards, probably wondered, why'd he leave? Where is he going, or what has transpired here that he suddenly had to walk out? He's kind of left everything hanging here. But, of course, if you know anything about Egyptian... what's that?
You don't show that kind of thing.
Well, not only that, but if he's dressed as an Egyptian, Egyptians, even the men, liked a lot of makeup.
Yeah,
They'd put a lot of black garbage on their eyes, and, if he's getting a little weepy-eyed here, that would be, certainly for somebody in Joseph's position, that would be undignified.
Embarrassing.
And embarrassing. So he probably has to make a quick exit and clean himself up and possibly reapply his makeup to his eyes. Verse 31 says, Then he washed his face and came out, and he controlled himself and said, Serve the meal. Now, this is the interesting part here. In serving the meal, you might imagine this big serving table with Joseph at one end, his brothers lined on either side of it, and the stewards coming and serving them, but that's not how this would have been done. They would have actually set up at least 3 different tables. Joseph would have been at a table by himself, his brothers at a table by themselves, and then any other Egyptians present, any servants, any other dignitary. Well, of course, if there were servants and dignitaries, they would have had their own individual tables, but probably the Egyptian servants that would have been there, they would have had a separate table. Of course, we can figure that the reason Joseph had his own table is the fact that he's the prime minister of Egypt. And he would not have or it would have been inappropriate for him to eat at the same table with his servants. Then he would not have eaten with his brothers, because even though Joseph is himself a Hebrew, as far as the Egyptians are concerned, and there may be a lot of the Egyptians at this point that probably don't know really what Joseph's true nationality is, because at this point he speaks fluent Egyptian. He's dressed as an Egyptian, probably got a shaved head like an Egyptian. And since they are both of Middle Eastern origin, they don't look that much different. So they would not, and even if he, was known to them to be a Hebrew, as far as they're concerned, that would have been irrelevant. He's prime minister of Egypt, so he would have been treated as an Egyptian. And Egyptians and Semitics did not socialize with each other. They were definitely of a different class, and I'll explain why as we get a little farther into that. But imagine, if you will, a large dining area with at least 3 different tables set up. All right, verse 32. So they served him by himself, that's one table, and them by themselves, table 2, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is loathsome to the Egyptians. All right, now again, why is this such a loathsome practice? A lot of Semitics, including at this point Jacob's family, were shepherds and cattlemen. Egyptians absolutely despised animal husbandry. They did not socialize with shepherds. They didn't socialize with cattlemen. They were an agrarian society. So farmers they respected. Herdsmen they did not. And the reason being is while Egyptians did eat meat, they didn't eat cattle. They would eat, of course, pork,
Ostrich.
sheep. Well, back then, maybe, not, you could catch one. Fowl, to include ostrich.
Fish.
Yeah, fish. Pretty much any kind of meat other than cattle. Now, they would not eat cattle because in some of their religions, they viewed cattle as being sacred. By the way, remember Pharaoh's dream? The first thing that he saw was the cattle coming up out of the Nile River, and 7 fat ones, and then the 7 gaunt ones that ate up the 7 good ones. Well, now that would have been a puzzling dream to Pharaoh, which is one of the reasons why he had to have Joseph interpret it for him, because to the Egyptian, they didn't eat cattle. They just didn't understand that. So this is one of the reasons why, when he's got a group of people here with him that they know are shepherds and cattlemen, they don't socialize with them. They would have been disgusted with that. And we see that happen again later when Jacob and his whole family come back later and are introduced to Pharaoh. And Joseph tells him later on, here in a couple of chapters, don't say that you're shepherds. And of course, what do? They say it anyway. But we'll deal with that when we get that far. Verse 33. By the way, we'll go down to the end of the chapter and we'll call it quits at chapter 44. It says, now they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in astonishment. Why would this be so astonishing to them?
Because he knew the order.
Yeah. How did this guy know which one of us is the oldest? Well, he knows that Benjamin's the youngest because he's been told that. Probably knows which one's the oldest because I'm sure at some point Reuben was the spokesman for him. But how did he know the birth order of all the rest of them? You'd think at this point they would begin to wonder, okay, something really fishy is going on here. How did this man know who's first, second, third, if you only had 2 or 3, in a family, and you can kind of look at them and figure, okay, we can figure out who's the oldest and who's in the middle and who's the youngest. But when you're talking about a total of 12 brothers, how in the world did he know which one was which?
I've been skipping ahead, and the deception goes on for quite a while.
Yeah.
I was thinking it was all coming to a head soon.
Well, it does after one more chapter. But you also got to keep in mind that while we look at this and say, well, that's a whole chapter, this could have taken place in a very short period of time for them. Anyway, verse 34 says he took portions to them from his own table. Now, what this tells us is that after they were served, Joseph, even though he was seated at a different table, provided them additional food directly from his own table, which I'm sure his servants were kind of puzzled about. It said, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. So they feasted and drank freely with him. Now, once again, they're all sitting around, probably having a good meal, and then Joseph is personally taking over a pile of extra food and piling it on, in front of Benjamin. You'd think one of them by this point would start looking, let me get a closer look at that guy. But they don't get it.
It also shows that Jacob isn't the only one who plays favorites. His sons have their favorite brothers as well, brothers of the same mother.
Well, that's kind of halfway understandable. I mean, I can understand Joseph's favoritism of his full brother Benjamin as opposed to all the half-brothers. Plus, as far as settling him into slavery, Benjamin had nothing to do with that. So I'm not saying I agree with it, but I can at least understand it from Joseph's perspective.
I'm just saying, though, it kind of reflects a little bit of Dad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with Manasseh and Ephraim, but we'll get to that here in another couple of chapters. But anyway, questions so far this evening? All right, we will pick up with chapter 44 on Wednesday and see some more of this little favoritism going on. All right.